My name is Jonathan Parks, and welcome to Jonathan's Nature Crafts. I must inform you that I do not live in this house by myself, but live here with other people. Sometimes other members of the household may have to walk through areas where I might be recording with other family members on the phone. If you hear any noise like that, please feel free to disregard. We are doing our best to get noise-canceling equipment, which may at least keep you from hearing exactly what is being said. Thank you for considering. Now I want to say that just for tonight, I don't know exactly how long a video I will plan to record, but it could very well be that it just might even be until maybe I've recorded as long a video as maybe my tablet has enough room for, because I've recorded long videos before, and sometimes if it got to the point where the video got to be as long as would be the size that the memory on the tablet could hold, or the memory in my Amazon Photos account or whatever, that would probably be the part where it would just cut off automatically. It might get there before I'm finished. I don't know whether it will, but would like to say that there's a step I have drawn out on all of these figures, and think that I would like to take that step on every one of these before we end the video. And we'll just say that there's going to be a way that we're going to do it, and for all that we know, I say that we'll kind of take the step where along these lines we will shave off this part right here, and kind of, I'd say, just try to get rid of whatever little extra excess wood we may not need. I'd say my hands are feeling pretty tough today because I have carved like this just about all day with these heavier knives into these harder woods, and just for how the record goes, would say that it can be quite the piece of work when you get done about it. And so I say that it's just how this shall work about when we get things done to the point that we will have them the way we need them to be. Do want to mention, before I recorded those last two videos I did, I went to my Zumba class this afternoon. I'd say it was a good experience. I'd say I felt energetic enough to get the rest of the way through class. I'll tell y'all right now, as you can probably see, it is getting a little windy out here. The wind is blowing through the trees, blowing everything around. Thankfully, we are not out at a show dealing with this, because if it was, the wind would be knocking all my merchandise over, and depending on how strong a weight I had on my canopy, would probably just be blowing the canopy around. So we've kind of got to watch out for ourselves sometime, and what we do and what we show and what we put out. And I say that this is just a little memory of a thing we've gotten here together for us, and just to kind of see how brightly we can make things go and work for the good and the better in our world and us, and see how it makes a little happy day that we live and breathe and know that above all, God is in control. We know that in the Bible there were like whirlwinds, and they were probably just a biblical term for a tornado, maybe. Makes me think of this little verse about Elijah, and it goes like this. Something like, there was an earthquake, but the Lord wasn't in the earthquake. There was a whirlwind, but the Lord wasn't in the whirlwind. There was a fire, but the Lord wasn't in the fire. But after this, he heard a still small voice. Sometimes just the conditions we go through in life can remind us of that little saying that shows up in Scripture. It's a meaningful little saying that says a lot to us, and I say that one of those really good verses of Scripture to us. I say that these little carvings are what we can imagine them to be. When we all get finished with our work and our word, I say there's always a good God ahead of us who kind of has a real master plan, a plan that is bigger than ours. Sometimes we kind of have our thoughts, have our ways, and all the time, you know, there's a certain thing I learned, you know, as far as just the answers to knowing God's will and verses about understanding God's will. One of the most important ones to me has always been this one in Isaiah 55 that says, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts." There were times in my life when I certainly had thoughts and ways that were the ones I thought would come out to be the best. They really weren't for me. You know, the Lord knew better than I did, and when he says my ways are higher than your ways and my thoughts higher than your thoughts, he means my ways are better than your ways and my ways are better than your thoughts. So sometimes, just sometimes, there were times when I had certain plans in mind. Sometimes things that the Lord already knew were going to happen would be things which, when they did, it would ruin my plans. And sometimes, even in my experiences, among things I had to learn from these experiences was that lots of times, you know what your thoughts are, you know what your ways are, but you don't always know what God's thoughts are. You don't know what his ways are. And then when it'll come right down to it, you just know that whatever his thoughts are, they're not your thoughts. Whatever his ways are, they're not your ways. And that's just kind of how we see the little things that come about. Sometimes our plans were not the best. We sometimes have a feeling that God always had a plan B. He knew the things that were going to happen. He knew the things that would happen. I say that this is just a time when we learn in his word what we really learn through the prophet Isaiah. And I tell you that in the verse before that, there's one that says, "Let the wicked forsake his ways, and the evil man his thoughts. Let him turn to the Lord, and he will have mercy on him, and to our God, for he will freely pardon." That's one of those places where you know, the verse right after that comes the verse about his ways and his thoughts, and we know of all things being said there, that's especially what is said to be the reason why the wicked should forsake his ways and turn to the Lord and let the Lord have mercy on him, because we know that if you do forsake your ways and turn to the Lord and he has mercy on you, he will show you his thoughts, he'll show you his ways, and show you that his thoughts are higher than your thoughts and his ways higher than your ways. And there was one thing I think about as far as how it was when I was 11 years old and lost my grandfather. I really didn't know as a child what all my grandfather's plans were, but you know, he was still kind of probably at the time kind of in a place where he probably still, before he got real sick with his cancer, even while he pastored his church, he also painted houses for a living and thought, and I tell you, he was at that time the treasurer of this missions work called Baptist Faith Missions, which was started decades earlier by Hatford Overby and Z.E. Clark, but my grandfather's name was James Hamilton. He was the pastor of the Thompson Road Baptist Church, and kind of had the thing where, you know, he helped a lot with BFM and the missions work, and being the treasurer, which he was at the time, always the one you sent your offerings to if they were for BFM, and so it just kind of worked like that for him, and he was going to retire and tell people more about BFM. That was his plan, but the Lord chose to bring him home to heaven sooner. That was his ways, a way that was probably much better for him. You know, he couldn't have gotten better from his cancer, but I tell you, it started in his prostate and then went to his bones. Being the kid I was at the time, it was hard for me to understand, because after all, I say, he was, after all, my grandfather and was always right there in the house with my grandmother. There were times when, as a kid, probably never thought I'd lose him while I was still a kid. And I tell you, there were times when I think about how even after he died, I'd sometimes say to my grandmother, you know, I made plans for Pawpaw to stay with us. She tells me, I know you did, and I did too, but that wasn't what the Lord wanted. So, you know, it's like kind of where there were times when it was in my vision after he passed that I was kind of looking up to heaven saying, I went up there and be with you, and he says, no. Says, you must go back to earth and stay. It's not your turn to come here yet, but one day I'll see you again. I say that, you know, that was probably the first time I ever lost someone to death that was ever even a little bit close to me, and many more have passed away as I've moved on. I'd say, you know, I kept my other three grandparents until I was 33, which was how old I was when my paternal grandfather died, just from old age and dementia. I'd say I was 39 when my maternal grandmother died, on the same side as the grandfather I lost at age 11, and I was 43 when I lost my paternal grandmother. She was already getting old and getting about ready to go, and so it was all these things where, you know, there was just a lot of stuff I wasn't quite online doing as much in those days, but these days there's probably a little more I'd come on to share than I used to. Think I told you all sometime before that this particular piece of African mahogany was a little bit off in the grain, and that being the reason why there were some parts of it that were, I'd say, just a little bit harder to carve, harder to get around. But I say, you know, even when a piece of wood gets a little hard, I have my ways of getting around little problems like that. Think I might get out the little knife and kind of work along this piece here, kind of get rid of some of this extra wood that comes along the back. I say, there were all kinds of strange little things, like all those old commercials about hair products and infomercials, and how those commercials used to gross my mom out. And one thing I can think of in particular that was in one of those commercials was where they showed this man's back with all this hair, and how they sprayed that stuff on his back and took a towel and wiped all the hair off. I'd say little strange things from those old infomercials, and all the little gross things about it. One day we were kind of just come home from church one Sunday night, and we were in front of the TV, and especially given the fact that she was eating at that moment, she said, "Can somebody come turn this hair commercial off?" I say that little strange things happen in life. Might come around to getting a little sharpening on this knife again. It's probably needing it. Don't know if I should even be using this side of the stone or not. There might be coming a time sooner or later that it might be time to replace this stone, because it might be getting to the point where you see all the little tan stuff is coming off and all the gray's showing underneath. So kind of come along here, and I say get a little extra work done into this boy, and I'd say into this Joseph figure, that is. You know, there were times as a kid, the first time I heard of the Joseph of the Old Testament was probably just at a time when I was a kid and listening to that song that was on that Statler Brothers cassette tape that my aunt and uncle played in their car. And it was a little song that went, "Joseph had a coat of many colors. Joseph had a closet full of dreams." And I forget what that third line was, but the last line was, "And Joseph had a dream and it came true." And, you know, that was probably around the same time as a kid that I was sort of hearing about the Mary and Joseph who raised Jesus. And that time as a kid, I really couldn't separate the Old Testament from the New Testament. So I didn't really know exactly how many people in the Bible could have had the same names in those days, or how common names really were in Bible times, and probably also didn't even realize just how there could be so many things not to know about the Bible. But I've learned a whole lot more, and about all the different people there were who all had the same names in the Bible. And I'd say it comes down to it where I was even asking if the Joseph who had a coat of many colors was the same Joseph as the one who raised Jesus. I was probably only about 9 years old when I asked that question, and the answer was no, they were just two different people in two different eras. So that was just a little story about how that came out in those days. Funny little stories, they have special meanings, and we talked about just how many years earlier that would have been. Of course, my sister was still a child too, so she thought the Joseph who had a coat of many colors probably came millions of years before the Joseph who raised Jesus. But I tell y'all that was probably because we may not have known as kids that there weren't even that many millions of years in biblical timelines. And I say that these days there's a lot more people have in life. People have evolution theories these days. They have Darwin theories, and if you believe those, you're welcome to do so, but I don't believe them. I believe in the Word of God, and I believe in creation. You're free to believe whatever you choose. But as for me, I believe in Adam and Eve. I believe they were tempted in the Garden of Eden by the serpent. It wasn't that long ago we kind of did some videos where we talked about the fruits of the trees and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Many of us, we kind of see the kind of world we live in. We want to blame Adam and Eve for eating of the wrong tree. We think if we had been in the Garden of Eden, we wouldn't have done it. But we can't really say that, you know. We would have been tempted just like they were. And we would have brought sin into the world just like they did. Even we, if we had been faced with the choices they were, we would have wanted to be like God. We would have wanted to know the knowledge of good and evil. And nobody, not even Adam and Eve, knew evil before they ate of that tree. Only God did. And once they ate of that tree and recognized evil, they saw that they were naked. So they made themselves little skirts and robes out of fig leaves to wear. And they hid in the bushes when they heard the Lord coming. And when they said that they knew they were naked and that was why they hid, the Lord said, "Who told you so? Have you eaten of that tree I told you not to eat of?" And then Adam stated that Eve tempted him. Eve stated that the serpent tempted her. And in those days, you know, snakes still walked on legs, but all because the serpent tempted Eve. And even so, the devil himself spoke through the serpent. And for that very reason, the snake lost its legs and had to crawl on its belly and eat the dust of the earth. At least so, that was how it was in those days. But we know that creatures did not really become carnivorous until after the flood. It was probably after the flood that snakes started to prey on things like mice and rats, eggs and birds and lizards and frogs and salamanders. And so I say that this was just kind of how we saw things in our days. I got one more little figure of Joseph to carve along, and we'll say that we'll get along, take it to the next level. Maybe with this one, it's going to be a little different because I say, we're starting from a different place on the statue, and we know that these are great little nativities, and I know one thing for sure, that there have been people in this world who have thought different things of nativity figures. Some people think of them as being what the Bible calls graven image. I believe that there is such a thing as a graven image, but it always had different meaning in the Bible. We also know that when Exodus backslid on Mount Sinai, it was a time when they all put their earrings together and made the golden calf and worshiped the calf instead of God. So it was a time when he sort of had to send Moses down with the tablets on which he wrote the 10 Commandments, and had to give them those commandments because, you know, in those days there was a lot to say about history. Some of this stuff I learned about in church, and some of it I learned in 7th grade history class. And a lot of the same stuff that was in the Bible was also probably part of my 7th grade social studies curriculum. I'd say that it's always good to kind of have a memory like mine. I like to be able to remember things the way I do. And that's just one reason why I can tell so many stories that go a long way. Some people think that something bad had to have happened to me for me to have the kind of memory I do, but that's not true. It was just kind of a little natural thing in my case. It's like these days, you know, there's things in life you think people remember, but they don't. I wasn't always aware when I was a teenager of how good my memory was. I would ask some people I knew questions about, like if they were in high school or college from when we were in middle school together, and they're like, no, I don't remember that. See them in places and they kind of don't remember the things I said to them that hurt them, or even some of the crazy and silly things I did that offended them. But I tell y'all that there was so much to learn and so much to know from this. I say that as for now, we gotta remove this little area from the back of this Joseph's head and take it where it's going to be the work that the knife does. They taught us when we first started carving how to do a certain thing where we just let the knife do the carving. I tell y'all people, I have such strong hands, and that's why I have such potential that I can carve so aggressively into things. And I say that there's been people I've been in a woodcarver's guild with who they would take these tough things like those cypress knees and say, I'm not like Jonathan. I could not carve this with my hands. So I say it probably is just a matter of a sensory thing. Maybe it's because of my autism that it feels like stress relief whenever I can carve into these harder things like this. Maybe it's because of my potential. I've just always had a way of being able to do things with a strong body and strong hands that most people couldn't in a rather clever way. But I say, getting to where we've been on here for almost 30 minutes and time to kind of bring things to an end. So I just want to thank you all for coming on again. It was good to be out here on the porch in this nice cool breeze tonight. Not too hot. And I'd say it's getting kind of closer to nighttime, closer to dark. About the time to pack things up and go back in. Don't know what else I'll be doing for the evening. Don't know what kind of plans I have. But I say that it's going to be all kinds of nice and weather and good night to sleep. And oh, I say thank you all for coming on. Take care. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed the video. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. I hope to see you in the next video. Stay tuned.